Thank you so much, Lonnie, and thank you all for coming out here. It's an honor to be here speaking before you. What I want to do tonight is to change the way that you think about adolescence, and along the way, change the way that you think about how we should parent kids and educate them and treat them in our society. I wrote Age of Opportunity because I think that this change is long overdue. I'm going to touch on a lot of different topics in my talk this evening, but if there are things that I don't talk about that you'd like to ask about, we will have time, as Lonnie said, for Q&A, and I'm happy to answer or do my best to answer any questions about adolescence that you might have. Tomorrow morning at New Trier, I'm going to focus more on kind of hands-on issues in the raising of teenagers and with more specific guidance and information for parents of people in this age than I will tonight. I've been doing research on adolescence for now close to 40 years. I've studied kids from all over the United States, different walks of life, different ethnic groups, different social classes. I've studied kids from all over the world. We're just finishing up research involving a sample of 5,000 people between the ages of 10 and 30 in 12 different countries, some of which are very wealthy, like Sweden, some of which are very poor, like Kenya and Jordan. For a while, I had the privilege of chairing the National Academy's Committee on Adolescence. I have a pretty good sense of what the science of adolescence says, and I'm always struck by the disconnect between what we know about adolescent development from a scientific perspective and the popular portrayal of adolescence that's presented in the media. If you were to go to a bookstore now and go to the section where they keep books for parents of adolescents, what you'll find are a lot of survival guides. And that's basically the way that we think about adolescence. It's something to be survived. I Googled the combination of the words survive and adolescence to see what would come up, and I got back 2.3 million hits. Then out of curiosity, I tried the combination of the words enjoy and adolescence. And I got back 5 million hits, twice as many. And I thought, I really need to think about this differently. Maybe I'm all wrong about this, until I looked at what the hits actually were. So out of the 5 million hits for the combination of the words enjoy and adolescence, the first 5 were all for the same book. It's a book that's called Surviving Your Child's Adolescence. And the reason that enjoy snuck in there was that the subtitle of the book was How to Understand and Even Enjoy the Rocky Road Toward Independence. I looked on Amazon at what was out there, books for parents of teenagers, and I found no fewer than 12 books that had the word survive or survival in the title. There's even, and I'm not kidding, there is even a book, you can look it up yourself, called How to Survive Your Dog's Adolescence. And yet, I could not find a single book, not one, on infancy that had the word survive or survival in the title. And this may surprise some of you who recently had a baby, because when I was a new father, I really wondered whether I was going to be able to survive this period of time. So this survivor's mentality hasn't done us very well. It's not working very well, at least in the United States. In international comparisons of high school student achievement, our students are almost always at the bottom of the list. And yet, our adolescents are among the world leaders in obesity, STDs, unintended pregnancies, binge drinking, illegal drug use, and violence. So clearly, we're doing something wrong. And I think it has something to do with the way in which we think about adolescence, and that's why I'm talking to you tonight, to try to get you to think about it in a different way. Now, obviously, if you're the parent of an adolescent or a teacher who works with people this age, or a young person yourself, or counselor, practitioner, it's important to have the right view of what adolescence is, and we should care a lot about getting it right and doing right by our kids. But I think it's more than that. We all have a stake in making sure that the next generation of young people are happy and healthy and competent. There's another reason why I think we should care about adolescence and think about it differently, and that has to do with the nature of the period itself. Adolescence is a much longer stage of life now than it's ever been. It's been stretched at both ends. It's been stretched by the earlier and earlier onset of puberty, and at the back end, it's been stretched by the delayed transition of people into adulthood. Let's talk about the first of those. At the beginning of the 20th century, the average American girl began menstruating, got her first period when she was about 14 and a half years old. Today, it's about 12. Pediatricians all over the United States are reporting seeing increasing numbers of girls who are 7 or 8 years old showing the early signs of puberty, like breast development. That's second grade. Okay? There have been comparable declines in the age of puberty for boys in the United States as well. The average American boy today goes through puberty about 2 years earlier than his counterpart did in the 1970s. There's a number of factors that have contributed to this drop in the age of puberty. Probably the most important is obesity. We know that children who have more fat on them go through puberty earlier than children who are leaner. And as I'm sure most of you know, there has been an epidemic of childhood obesity in this country, and that has driven down the average age at which kids in America go through puberty. So that's one cause. A second is the increased exposure of our children to chemicals that disrupt their endocrine system. And these endocrine disruptors are ubiquitous in modern life. They're in foods, they're in cosmetics, they're in plastics, and not just water bottles, but plastics that we sit on. They're in pesticides. And these chemicals have been shown to accelerate the onset of puberty, and they're another contributing factor. A third factor, and one that you probably aren't aware of, is the exposure of our children to so much artificial light. We know that kids who grow up closer to the equator go through puberty earlier than those who grow up near the poles. And the reason for that is that if you grow up closer to the equator, you have a more cumulative exposure to light during your childhood. And it turns out that artificial light has the same effect on the onset of puberty as natural light does. Moreover, the kind of light that's emitted from computer monitors and smartphones and tablets seems to be particularly powerful in changing the way our brains work. It affects the melatonin system, and that in turn affects the onset of puberty. And the fact that kids are spending so much more time in front of these screens and so much less time sleeping is contributing to earlier puberty as well. So adolescence starts earlier than it ever has. It goes longer than it ever has as well. We see this in the prolongation of schooling. People are staying in school much longer, in the delay of marriage, in the delay of parenthood, and in the prolongation of economic dependence of adolescents on their parents. So just to put some numbers on it for you, 25-year-olds today are twice as likely to still be students as their parents were when they were that age. They're only half as likely to be married, and they're 50% more likely to be receiving money from their parents. So it clearly is taking people longer to move from adolescence into adulthood. By my estimate, adolescence today lasts about 15 years long. That's twice as long as it did in 1950 and 3 times as long as it did in the 19th century. Now, when adolescence was a shorter period of time, it might have made sense to approach it as something to be survived. But when it's 15 years long, it doesn't seem like the right way to approach it. We need a new model, a new vision of what this period of life is and what we should be doing as adults who care about kids. And I think, fortunately, we can look to science for some guidance here. And what science tells us is that adolescence is not just something to survive. It's a time when people can really thrive. And we just need to be able to take advantage of the opportunity. Now, I want you to just think for a moment about your own adolescence. I know that when I think about mine, I have exceptionally vivid and rich memories of that time of life. So not only do I remember the people and the places and the events that were important during those years, but I recall them with a level of detail that is much greater, much deeper than the level of detail with which I recall things from childhood or from my 30s, 40s, or 50s. It's almost as if my brain has stored those memories in 3D high-def format. What's odd about this is that my adolescence was very ordinary. I grew up in a suburb of New York, not unlike Evanston. Nothing terrible happened to my family during that time. Nothing especially wonderful happened during that time either. Life was about as exciting as standing on a people mover in O'Hare Airport. You kind of know exactly what's going to happen next to you, and it proceeded sort of one day at a time like that. So there's no special reason why I should recall adolescence better than other points in my life. And yet, if I think back, I can remember things that happened to me in 1967 when I was 15 years old, a couple years older than you. I can recall things from 1967 better than I can recall things that happened last week. And it turns out that I am not unusual in this respect. Studies show that most people remember adolescence more vividly and better than they remember other points in development. It's such a well-documented phenomenon that we psychologists felt the need to give it a name, and it's called the reminiscence bump. Now, the reminiscence bump, the fact that people remember adolescence better than other times of life, was thought at first to be due to the nature of the experiences that happened to us during that time period. Because actually, a lot of very momentous things happen during adolescence. Your first love, your first job, your first beer, maybe the first time you lived away from your parents. But research that drilled a little deeper on this found that even mundane aspects of life are recalled better from adolescence than other periods of development. So it's not just because there are all these momentous things that happen. And it's not only personal events that are recalled better from adolescence. Just think about it. The movies, the books, the music, even the news stories that we're exposed to during adolescence are recalled better than those same things that we're exposed to at other points in development. So if it's not the nature of the events that makes adolescence so memorable, what is it? It looks like it has something to do with the adolescent brain. The adolescent brain is exquisitely sensitive to experience. It's almost as if its sensors have been turned up to record things that might be overlooked in other points in development. And this supersensitivity of the adolescent brain to experience is one factor that contributes to the adolescent brain being more easily shaped by experience. The adolescent brain is very malleable. The word neuroscientists use to describe this is plastic. Now, we've known for some time that the early years, what we often refer to as 0 to 3, comprise a period during which the brain is very plastic and very malleable, very influenced by the environment. It's a relatively recent revelation that adolescence is a second period of heightened brain plasticity. This is one of the most exciting discoveries about the adolescent brain that has come out in recent years. Now, let's think about this a little bit. The brain is always somewhat plastic. We wouldn't be able to learn anything if the brain was not plastic, because whenever you learn something and retain the knowledge, there must be some underlying change in your brain, or else there'd be no way of having that information stored. And because we know we can learn things during adulthood, the brain must have some degree of plasticity then. But what we now understand is that the brain is plastic in a very different way during adulthood than it is during childhood or adolescence. During childhood and adolescence, the brain is still being built. New brain circuits are being established, connections between brain cells or neurons. Brain circuits that are no longer needed are being eliminated. The brain is becoming much more efficient, much more effective. These large-scale transformations in the way the brain is wired don't occur after adolescence. So even though your brain can change during adulthood, you've probably seen those infomercials, even though your brain can change during adulthood, the changes are relatively small. They're minor modifications of existing brain circuits, rather than the development of entirely new ones, or the wholesale elimination of unneeded ones. That kind of transformation doesn't happen after adolescence. So think about it as the difference between remodeling your house and redecorating your house. So during adolescence, you're still putting on additions and demolishing rooms that you don't need anymore, and putting in a new floor plan and rewiring and replumbing. And during adulthood, yeah, you're changing your house, but you're basically just changing the colors of the carpets and the curtains. Adolescence is the last time in human development when the brain will ever be that malleable. That makes it so important. It makes it, as I'll explain, so much of an opportunity that we need to be able to take advantage of. Now, when the brain is plastic, it's not malleable in all parts of the brain to the same degree at a given point in time. So the parts of the brain that are plastic during 0 to 3 are not the same necessarily as the parts of the brain that are plastic during adolescence. Things like the visual system of the brain are no longer plastic after infancy. This is why our vision doesn't improve after we grow out of infancy and into childhood. Systems in the brain that govern things like motor coordination lose a lot of plasticity after childhood. This is why, and I speak from experience, if you don't learn how to hit a golf ball when you're a child, it's very difficult to learn how to hit it well when you're an adult. And this is why it's very hard to pick up a musical instrument as an adult that you haven't played beforehand, or learn a foreign language that you haven't learned beforehand. It's not impossible to do those things. It's just much harder because those brain systems are hardened. They're not as plastic anymore. During adolescence, a part of the brain that's particularly plastic is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that's right behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex we might think of as being the CEO of the brain. It's responsible for all of what psychologists call the executive functions of the brain, for higher order cognitive abilities like decision-making and planning, thinking ahead. It's also very important for self-regulation or self-control, our ability to control our thoughts and our feelings and our acts. Self-control is probably the single most important trait that a person should have in order to be happy and successful in life. This has been found in hundreds and hundreds of studies, that kids who have strong self-control and who can delay gratification and who can regulate themselves well, kids with strong self-control do better in school. They have better relationships, they have better mental health, they're less likely to get into trouble. So if you're a parent, one of the most important traits you can instill in your child to improve your child's chances of life success is a strong sense of self-control. Self-control is a better predictor of success in school or in work than either intelligence or talent. So it's really important to help our children develop this. And the fact that adolescence is the time when parts of the brain that govern self-control are especially plastic means that we can do things during adolescence to help strengthen this vital skill. On the other hand, having poor self-control is a lifelong liability. We can see this in many ways. One way that makes it very obvious is by looking at the factors that lead people to live a life of poverty. Sociologists and economists have identified 4 rules that, if you follow, pretty much guarantee that you will have at least a minimally decent life. Graduate from high school, don't have a child until you're married, don't break the law, and don't be idle. If you're unemployed and out of school, take the first job somebody offers you. If you're employed and you don't like it, don't quit it until you have Plan B lined up. And people who play by those rules almost never end up being poor. And this is not a moral judgment, by the way. This is just a statistical fact. And when we think about what leads people to break those rules, very often poor self-control is a part of it. It's one of the reasons that people drop out of high school. It's one of the reasons that they get pregnant before they want to be pregnant. It's one of the reasons that people break the law. In fact, it's one of the most important reasons why people break the law. It's one of the reasons why people walk off of a job impulsively without having something else lined up. Now, I know that there are circumstances in people's lives that also contribute to these problems, but poor self-control compounds the adverse effects of those circumstances. If we could do something to strengthen all children's self-control, we could do something to address income inequality and close the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about the relationship between self-control and adolescence and income inequality, and who are the winners and who are the losers in this new adolescence that we have confronting us today. Having strong self-control is not just important because it facilitates academic success. It also protects kids against some of the most virulent threats to their health. We have made a lot of progress in the developed world in the prevention and treatment of illness and disease during adolescence. Adolescence is one of the healthiest times in the life cycle. And today in the developed world, the major threats to kids' health and well-being are not disease or illness. They're things that kids do to each other and to themselves. They're behavioral in nature. And they're often the product of a lack of self-control. Because self-control is still developing during adolescence. It's still maturing during that time period. And brain science is helping us understand why poor self-control is often a contributor to the risky and reckless behavior that adolescents typically engage in. As Lonnie mentioned in her introduction, one of the areas in which I work is on understanding adolescent risk-taking and decision-making. Risky behavior peaks during adolescence. And this is true across a very wide range of behaviors that on the surface don't seem to have anything to do with each other. Crime reaches its highest point during adolescence. Self-inflicted injury, like cutting. Experimentation with drugs and alcohol. Reckless driving. Even accidental drownings are higher during adolescence than during other points in development. This is very surprising if you think about it, because there doesn't seem to be an obvious reason why 16-year-olds should drown more than 6-year-olds or 36-year-olds, but they do. And we can assume that because 16-year-olds are generally pretty strong, that the reason that they have more accidental drownings is not because they run out of stamina, it's because they exercise poor judgment about when and where to swim. Almost all types of risky behavior follow a kind of upside-down U-shaped curve, increasing from pre-adolescence into mid to late adolescence, and then decreasing as people mature into adulthood. Advances in brain science explain what's going on. Puberty affects the brain in many ways. One thing that puberty does to the brain is it makes the brain more plastic. That's one of the reasons that plasticity increases quite dramatically at the beginning of adolescence, because of the way sex hormones affect the brain. Sex hormones, of course, lead to an increase in our sex drive and change our reproductive functioning and our physical appearance, but they have much more pervasive effects on the brain than that. They arouse the brain in many ways. One of the most interesting things that puberty does to the brain is it accentuates our experience of pleasure. It makes good things feel better. It does this by increasing activity in the brain involving the neurotransmitter dopamine. And the dopamine is important for many functions in the brain, but one of its critical functions is in our experience of reward or pleasure. So whenever you anticipate something good happening, or whenever you actually experience something pleasurable, it doesn't matter what it is, food, sex, money, praise, chocolate, whenever you experience an intense feeling of pleasure, you get a little dopamine squirt. And that's what makes you feel so good. And there's more dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers during adolescence than at any other point in development. Do we have any teenagers with us tonight in here? Oh, I was going to deliver some, we have one? I was going to deliver some, I don't know, I guess kind of mixed news, maybe bad news for most of us, but not for you. Nothing will ever feel as good to you for the rest of your life as it did when you were a teenager. Nothing. And that's because of this high level of dopamine activity in your brain during that period of time. There's a decrease in dopamine activity as we move into adulthood. Here's something that's very, very sad to me. There's a part of your brain that is sort of the center of the reward center. It's called the nucleus accumbens. Right? It's in your limbic system. It's deep inside your brain. And this is where pleasure is really experienced when we feel good about something. Your nucleus accumbens grows between childhood and adolescence, and it shrinks between adolescence and adulthood. Even sweet things, it turns out, taste sweeter when you're a teenager than during other points in time. Now, just imagine living at a point in your life where good things just feel so good. You're going to be on the lookout for rewards. You're going to be on the lookout for exciting and potentially pleasurable experiences. And you're going to pursue those experiences even if there are risks or dangers involved. This is something that psychologists refer to as sensation seeking. Sensation seeking reaches its peak during adolescence. The problem is that during this time period, when individuals are impelled to seek out exciting and pleasurable experiences, the parts of the brain that we use to regulate those impulses are still very immature. They're still developing. It's like starting the engines without having a good braking system in place. And those engines get ignited long before the braking system reaches adult levels of maturity. And that's one of the reasons that adolescence is a time of such heightened risk-taking and recklessness, because the accelerator is pressed to the floor and there isn't a skilled driver yet behind the wheel. So another reason that it's important to give kids experiences that help develop self-control is that it helps build a better braking system, which will help protect them against some of the dangers of risk-taking and reckless behavior. Now, we spend a lot of money in this country trying to get teenagers not to engage in these kinds of risky and reckless behaviors. And the main way that we do that, and I would guess that you do it here in Evanston as well, is through school-based health education programs. And school-based health education, classroom-based education, is founded on the premise that if we just tell kids what's risky, what can happen to them if they do it, and how to avoid doing it, then they won't do it. I know you're laughing. It's so naive. It's as if the people that came up with this idea had never been teenagers themselves. And we know from evaluations of these programs that they're very good at changing what kids know, but they're not very good at changing how kids behave. And the reason, as we now understand it, is that adolescents don't engage in risky behavior because they're ill-informed. Research shows that if you present kids with lists of potentially risky things and you ask them, is this risky? Could something bad to you happen if you did it? Is it dangerous? They answer the questions the same way that adults do. They know what's risky. They just engage in the behaviors anyway. The reason kids engage in a lot of risky behavior is not because they're ill-informed. It's because they got this accelerator that's pressed to the floor and they don't yet have a good braking system in place. It turns out that adolescence, evolutionarily speaking, is a time during which we're hardwired to be risk takers. It makes a lot of sense. When a juvenile animal goes through puberty, that animal now must compete with bigger and stronger animals for mates. In some species, the juvenile actually leaves the natal environment and goes off into the wild. In some, if the juvenile doesn't do it, the adults kick the juvenile out, an idea that's occurred to some parents from time to time. But think about what that involves. It's a very risky and dangerous enterprise to go off into the wild or go away from the adults that have supported you and raised you and protected you for all this time, and to compete with those bigger, stronger animals for access to mates. And so we've been evolutionarily built to be more willing to take risks during adolescence, because if we didn't do that, we wouldn't reproduce. So the idea that we can talk adolescents out of taking risks by giving them information is an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle against evolution and endocrinology, and it's not a battle that we're going to win, and we're not winning it at all. It's important, I think, that kids understand sex and drugs, different kinds of reckless behavior, and I think it's important that we give them clear guidance about avoiding things that can hurt them. But we shouldn't expect that those interventions are going to have much effect on how they actually behave. And what I've argued in the book is that we should think about changing the context in which kids live rather than trying to change kids. Let me give you some examples of successful interventions that have done that. We have been concerned for many years about adolescent cigarette smoking. It's very bad for you to smoke. We've known this for quite some time. And we've done a lot of different interventions to try to get kids not to smoke. The single intervention that's been most successful in doing that has been raising the price of cigarettes. That makes it harder for teenagers who don't have a lot of disposable income to get their hands on it. Change the context rather than the kid. This morning I was at a meeting for most of the morning and the afternoon at the Allstate Foundation, not far from here. I'm a member of the Foundation's Teen Safe Driving panel. We spent a lot of time talking about what we can do to bring down teen automobile fatalities. You probably know that automobile fatalities are the leading cause of death among adolescents in this country by far. And we've made some progress in that. But the progress that we've made has not been from driver education. Most of you would probably be amazed if you actually saw the scientific literature on driver education, because it has absolutely no impact on safe driving behavior. Zero. How did we bring down the rate of teen automobile fatalities? By things like graduated driver licensing, which you have here in Illinois, which don't allow adolescent drivers to drive with passengers in the car or certain hours of the day. I was exposed today to an intervention that would, I think, make a tremendous difference in teen automobile fatalities that I haven't even thought of before. It turns out that when parents get their kids' cars, for parents who do get their kids' cars, they don't spend enough money on the cars that they get them. And they buy them cars that are small and that are much more dangerous. And so the Institute for Highway Safety now has a list published, it's probably online, I saw it on paper today, of the cars that you should buy your kid if your kid is starting to drive, because they're very safe for teenagers and you can find them used and they don't cost you a fortune. Talk about an intervention that's not that hard to do that would really help bring down automobile fatalities among adolescents instead of driver education, which doesn't do anything at all. Just one more example of this. We know that the prime time for kids to experiment with drugs and sex and delinquency is between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. There have been a lot of studies that have shown this to be the case, because kids are home or in their friends' homes and their parents aren't around. It's not rocket science. If we had better after-school programming for people this age, in which kids were in interesting and stimulating and structured and supervised activities, we would do much more to deter experimentation with drugs and sex and delinquency than any classroom-based intervention could ever hope to do. And in the book, I suggest that we should divert some of the resources that we're spending on these ineffective and unproven health education programs like DARE or abstinence education, which don't work at all. And we should divert those resources into having more accessible after-school programs for kids in this age, which will do much more to diminish adolescent risky and reckless behavior. This is one example of a way in which I think we can use adolescent brain science to improve social and public policy for kids. Another comes from an area that I've worked in for quite some time now, which is juvenile justice. The United States tries a lot of kids as adults for serious crimes, and it sanctions them as adults. We're alone in the developed world in the extent to which that we do this. Of course, we're much more likely to incarcerate people of any age in the United States than other countries in the world are. What we know from research on trying kids as adults is that it doesn't work. So kids who commit serious crimes and are released from adult facilities are more likely to reoffend, and to reoffend sooner, and to reoffend more seriously than kids who committed the very same crimes and have the very same record but were sent to juvenile facilities. And the reason is that you're much more likely to receive some kind of rehabilitation if you get sent to a juvenile facility than if you get sent to an adult facility. And you're more likely to receive mental health services if you need them in a juvenile facility than in an adult facility. So it's very bad public policy to send so many kids into the adult criminal justice system. My colleagues and I took what we knew at the time about adolescent brain science and behavioral science, and we incorporated it into a series of amicus briefs that were filed with the United States Supreme Court in the cases that Lonnie mentioned, in the juvenile death penalty case, in cases involving life without parole for juveniles convicted of serious crimes. And we helped use this science to persuade the court that kids are different, and that simply committing a heinous crime doesn't turn you magically into an adult. And that kids need to be treated differently from adults, even when they commit serious and violent crimes. And we were successful in those Supreme Court rulings, and we've been successful in arguing this case in many states as well. And the basic argument that we made was that if kids are inherently less able to control their behavior, and if they're inherently risk takers and sensation seekers, then they're inherently less responsible for how they act. And that makes them less deserving of the most severe punishments that we reserve for the most responsible criminals who are fully and completely responsible for their acts. And a second argument that we made drawing on the science of brain plasticity, is that adolescents are much better candidates for rehabilitation because their brains are still plastic. They're still malleable. And therefore, we shouldn't put somebody in prison for life for something that he did at the age of 15, when at 15 he still has the potential to change, much less execute somebody for something that he did at such a young age. So I think we can use the science of adolescence to make better public and legal policy. I want to tell you a little bit about some exciting research we've done in our lab at Temple that, again, supports the idea that there's something special about adolescence that helps explain risky and reckless behavior. We call it the peer effect. So this notion that adolescents are much more likely to engage in sensation-seeking and pursue rewards even when there are risks or dangers involved turns out to be even truer when kids are with their friends than when they're by themselves. And I'm sure that most of you can think back to your own adolescence and would agree that you did a lot of dumb things when you were with your friends that you wouldn't have done had you been alone. Does that sound familiar to some of you? And parents looking at your own children's behavior see that they behave in different ways when they're with their friends. We wanted to try to understand this. So we conducted a series of studies in which we had people come to our lab and play a variety of risk-taking games on computers. One of the games mimics a situation that anybody who drives has been in, where you're driving a car, it's a video driving game, and you approach a series of intersections, and each time you get to an intersection, the traffic signal turns yellow, and you have to decide whether you're going to run the light or not. And we explained to you that three things can happen. You can put the brakes on, and the light will cycle back around from yellow to red to green, and then you can go again. You lose time off the clock, but you go through safely. You can take a chance and run the intersection and get through safely, and you don't lose as much time off the clock. Or you can take a chance and crash into a car that's coming through the intersection, and you lose a lot of time off your clock, and that's bad in terms of how the game is scored. So we randomly assign people to play this game either by themselves or with their friends watching them. But their friends aren't encouraging them or saying anything to them, they're just watching them. And what we found was that adolescents take twice as many risks when their friends are watching them play this game than when they play the game by themselves. Adults play the game the exact same way when they're by themselves versus being observed by their friends. So after we did this experiment, we took it into the brain imaging setting, and we imaged people while they were playing the same game. And we found, once again, that adolescents take more risks when their friends are watching them. Their friends are watching them from an adjacent room on a monitor than when they're alone. But adults take the same number of risks when their friends are watching them than when they're alone. But what was really interesting was that we found that when adolescents were playing this game and their friends were watching them, their reward centers were lighting up. And that lighting up of the reward centers made them pay more attention to the potential rewards of getting through that intersection and less attention to the potential downside of crashing. So it seems that not only are adolescents hardwired to take risks, they're hardwired to experience intense feelings of reward and pleasure when they're with their peers. The last experiment we did on this involved adolescent mice. So we took mice and we raised them in groups of three, a mouse from each of three different litters. So we created these little peer groups. And then when half the mice were adolescents, we tested them. And when the other half the mice were adults, we tested them. Mice, I'm sure you know this, but just in case, mice go through puberty, so we know when adolescence is in the lifespan of a mouse, just like we know when it is in a human being. And the test that we put the mice through was to put them in a cage, either by themselves or with their peers, and see how much alcohol they drank. They had unlimited access to alcohol. So the adolescent mice drink more when they're in the cage with their friends than when they're by themselves. But the adult mice drink the same amount when they're by themselves and with their friends. Right? There's something that's hardwired about adolescence that makes us behave the way that we do at that point in time. Now, When the brain is highly plastic, as it is during adolescence, it's an opportunity because we can intervene and help strengthen brain systems that we want to make stronger. But it also makes adolescence a time of vulnerability, because the brain doesn't know the difference between good experiences and bad experiences. It's just plastic. It's just malleable. Adolescence is a time of heightened vulnerability as well as heightened opportunity. And we see this in a number of different ways. Adolescence is the most common period in human development for the onset of a mental health problem. Across all serious mental illnesses, the average age of onset is 14. One reason is that the adolescent is very responsive to stress in the environment, which can often trigger the onset of a mental disorder. A second indication of vulnerability of the adolescent brain comes from research on drugs and alcohol. Exposure to recreational drugs early in adolescence is much, much worse for your brain than the same amount of exposure later on. Somebody who starts using alcohol or nicotine or an illicit drug before the age of 15 is 7 to 10 times more likely to develop an addiction than somebody who postpones the use of the drug until age 21 or later. I have to say that when I've given this talk to high school students, the first question that they always ask is, well, doctor, you said that we shouldn't do it before 15, it would be better to wait until after 21, but what about between 15 and 21? We're not precise enough yet. But that's because parts of the brain that respond to recreational drugs are still very plastic during early adolescence, and they can be permanently affected by chronic exposure to these substances. This is now a special concern because of changes in marijuana laws around the country. And we haven't quite figured out what to do about this, because we now know that marijuana is not so good for your brain if you're a young adolescent. And in my view, we can talk about this later, the fact that it's being sold in the form of candy and cookies is not a very good idea in terms of keeping it out of the hands of people who might be more adversely affected by exposure to it. And the third index of vulnerability during adolescence, because of the way the brain is that the adolescent brain is much more stress responsive. Interesting study came out earlier this year that looked at the impact of growing up during wartime on life expectancy. So as you'd expect, growing up during a war is not good for you. It takes years off of your life. What the study found was that if you were an adolescent during the war, you lost more years off your life than if you were a child or an adult exposed to the very same war. And that's because, as I said, the adolescent brain is very stress responsive. I don't want to dwell on the vulnerability side of things, because I think we often only speak about adolescence in terms of negative aspects of it. What I want to turn my attention now to is the opportunity side of things. Because the same malleability that makes the brain vulnerable during adolescence makes adolescence an opportunity for positive growth. It's an opportunity that we're squandering. We need to change a lot of what we do in terms of how we raise kids. There's no better example of how we're squandering this opportunity than the American high school. I mentioned earlier that in international comparisons of achievement, our high school students are invariably near the bottom of the list. What's really interesting about that fact is that in the same international comparisons, our elementary students are almost always at the top of the list. And our middle school students are usually somewhere in the center of the distribution. So our poor standing internationally on tests of achievement is really limited to high school. And if you look at achievement differences within the United States, comparing elementary school, middle school, and high school students, you see a very similar pattern. Some of you may know that the federal government in the United States monitors student achievement annually, administers the same basic standardized test every year to nationally representative samples of American students. And it tests students in the 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. And it's been doing this for 40 years. If you look at the trend lines for 4th graders, what you see is that there's been improvement in student achievement over time. And if you look at the trend lines for 8th graders, there's been improvement in student achievement over time. Hasn't been tremendous, but it's been at least in the right direction. If you look at the trend lines for 12th graders, the lines are flat, and they've been flat for 40 years, and they're flat across every single subject area that we test. There's been no improvement in high school achievement in this country for 40 years. Shocking, really. And it's very hard to understand why this is. Because if you look at the variables that we typically talk about when we talk about school reform, things like teacher training, or per pupil expenditure, or class size, or teacher compensation. And if you compare our elementary schools and middle schools and high schools on these variables, our high schools are not disadvantaged by any means. We spend more money per student educating high school students than we do educating students who are younger. We pay high school teachers more than we pay middle school and elementary school teachers. Big study that was rating teacher training programs was published last year. It gave grades to training programs all over the country. The ones that train secondary school teachers get much higher marks than the ones that train elementary school and middle school teachers. So it's kind of perplexing. Why are our high schools so bad compared to high schools in other countries and elementary and middle schools in the United States? I think the answer is that our high schools aren't demanding enough. They're not challenging enough. And I say this because this is what students tell us in surveys of high school students. In those achievement comparisons that I mentioned before, the organization that administers the test, the OECD, often administers questionnaires to kids as well as achievement tests. And not that long ago, they asked kids to indicate how boring school was. You want to see us near the top of the list? We came in 3rd out of the 40 countries surveyed in terms of kids' rating of high school as boring. Only 1 out of every 6 high school students in America says that she's ever taken a single course that was difficult or challenging. Ever. 1 course, difficult or challenging. Surveys of foreign students who've taken a year in the United States during high school consistently show that these students say that their schools in their home country are much more challenging and harder than their schools are in the United States. And American students who spend a year abroad during high school say the same thing, that American schools are much easier. 70% of American high school students say that they would learn more in school if their schools were more demanding and had higher standards. For a lot of kids, school is just boring. It's very, very boring. It's repetitive, it's unchallenging, it's undemanding. And schools in many parts of the country have become places for socializing and for sports. Let's not forget that. They've become places where kids go to meet up with their friends and hang out with them. And they're not places where kids go to encounter challenge and being demanded of. I always feel funny giving this talk in a school district like this because I know that lots of your students here take very demanding and challenging courses, and they take a lot of AP classes, and they're in good schools that push them a lot. But I really want you to know that this is the exception in a very large educational wasteland. The proportion of college freshmen in this country who need remedial education is higher than the proportion who've ever taken a single AP class. So you can't look at Evanston or New Trier and say, well, everything is fine in the United States. It might be fine in these communities, but it's not fine all over. One of the consequences of our schools not being demanding enough is that our kids enter college not being academically prepared, which is why so many of them need remedial education. But another consequence of this is that kids are not facing challenge at a crucial point where brain systems are still developing that guide higher order thinking abilities. So in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion of what experts are calling non-cognitive skills. These are things like perseverance and determination and grit. And what we now know, as I mentioned before, is that these skills are often more important for success in school and in work than intelligence or talent. And because we're not pushing kids hard enough in high school, we're not giving them opportunities to develop these skills. In order to develop things like grit, you need to be challenged to the point where you fail every once in a while. Because it's through failing that you learn that you have to work harder the next time. And if we make things too easy for our kids, we deny them the opportunity to develop these really important skills. All right. I want to turn now to this issue of delayed adulthood that Lonnie mentioned. So, puberty opens the window of plasticity. But the window starts to close as we move from adolescence into adulthood. And we now even understand how the brain changes chemically in ways that make the brain less plastic, that make it harder for the brain to change in response to experience. We know that this happens when we move from adolescence into adulthood, but we don't know why it happens when it does. We just know that it does. But there's some interesting research that's come out in recent years that suggests that we might be able to keep this window open a little bit longer. Because it turns out that plasticity is itself a plastic trait. So certain experiences make the brain more plastic and keep the brain plastic longer. And those experiences are ones that expose us to novelty and challenge. So if we can provide our adolescents with experiences during this period of plasticity that challenge them and then expose them to novelty, it will keep that window open a little bit longer. And now when we think about what happens to life when you leave adolescence and enter the roles of adulthood, is that most people experience a huge drop in their exposure to novelty and challenge. You think about what happens when you enter into an entry-level job, and you're doing a lot of the same things over and over and over again. When you get married, you do a lot of the same things over and over and over again. Marital satisfaction drops precipitously during the first year of marriage, in part because of a decline in novelty. I'll leave it to those of you who are married to think about things you might do to change that. But for most people, leaving adolescence means leaving a lot of novelty behind. And leaving a lot of novelty behind means closing that window of brain plasticity. So as I was writing Age of Opportunity, I began thinking about this common complaint that people in their 20s today are taking so long to become adults. And it occurred to me that maybe this wasn't such a bad thing after all. Because if you're spending your 20s in interesting, stimulating, novel, challenging experiences, that may be good for your brain, that may be better for your brain than making an early transition into work and into marriage. So if you're the parent of somebody in his or her mid-20s, you probably shouldn't worry as much about the fact that it may be taking your kid longer to get into adulthood than it took you. The timetable is different now than it was, and it might even be better to take a little bit more time. You should worry more about what your child is doing during this time period than how long it's taking. I want to close with some suggestions for how we can take this new vision of adolescence and translate it into something that's a little bit more concrete. And I want to just leave you with 5 of these suggestions. The first is that we need to do a better job of spreading the word that adolescence is a second period of brain plasticity, a second opportunity for us to intervene, and probably the last best chance that we have to intervene. A lot of focus in the last couple of years on preschoolers, and I'm all for high-quality preschool education. But we've got to remember that this is an investment. It's not an inoculation. And we can't just invest in young children and cross our fingers and hope for the best. We've got to invest in all stages of child and adolescent development, but especially in adolescence now that we understand what's going on during this time period. Point number 2 is we need to do a better job of educating parents about how to be a better parent during adolescence. It's a focus of a chapter in Age of Opportunity, and it's a focus of a whole book of mine called You and Your Adolescent, which is what the focus of my talk tomorrow morning is going to be at New Trier. We know how to parent kids during this time period in ways that are going to help develop those important psychological skills like self-control, self-regulation, determination, perseverance. People like me aren't doing a good enough job getting that information out to parents, and we need to do a better job. And one of the things that we need to do is to stop telling parents that the best you can hope for during this time period is to survive. Because when you go into something in life and you think that the best you're going to do is endure it, is survive it, you're not going to invest any time trying to make it a better experience. You're just going to try to hold your breath until it's over. And we don't want parents going into adolescence thinking what I need to do is to hold my breath until my child gets out of this period of time, because you're wasting a really important opportunity. So that's point number 2. Number 3 is we have got to make our schools better. We've got to make high schools more demanding, and not just for affluent children, but for all children. All children need challenge and stimulation during the adolescent years to facilitate the development of those brain systems that are increasingly important as adolescence has become such a long period of time. I talk in the book about things that schools can be doing in addition to being more demanding and more challenging that can help this. Mindfulness training turns out to be very important for the development of self-regulation. Aerobic exercise turns out to be critical for brain development during adolescence. And it's a shame that so many school districts have cut out physical education and left exercise only to the star athletes in the school and not to all students, because all kids this age need it. And sleep. Kids need adequate sleep. An adolescent needs 8.5 to 9 hours of sleep a night, and it's important for brain development. It's not just important so that they're not tired the next day. It's really important for their health. So there are some things that we can do. A fourth point is that we need to step back and look at the laws that govern how we treat young people and align them better with brain science and with science more generally. A country that tries 12-year-olds as adults because they should know better, but doesn't let 20-year-olds buy beer because they're not old enough to handle it, is just deeply confused about things. And one that lets people drive when they're 16, which is about the most dangerous thing you can possibly do, but won't let them see R-rated movies until they're 17 because they might get harmed by all that sex, is just clueless, I think. So we really need to look at our laws governing young people and realign them. I have an op-ed coming out tomorrow in the Los Angeles Times arguing for lowering the voting age to 16, as many countries around the world have done and as the UK is considering doing. 16-year-olds have the cognitive capabilities to vote. They might not make the best decisions, but they won't make any worse ones than adults are making. And then finally, just to leave you with this thought, is that, we've got to stop thinking about adolescence as if it's a race to see who gets to adulthood first. It's a really important time in human development, and instead of trying to rush people through it, we should be trying to figure out how to make it a time of challenge and stimulation and novelty for all children, not just those whose families have the resources to do it. So that's my spiel. I hope you leave tonight thinking of adolescence differently, because adolescence is not a problem. It's an opportunity. Thank you very much.